Hello, everyone. I'm Joel. I'm here doing this workshop today because I enjoy reading and I enjoy writing, and I enjoy writing about the things that I've read, which is something I've done quite a bit of before, and also on behalf of the Commons about different books. My practice of book reviewing really grew out of a desire to just help me take as much as I could out of the books that I read. I really started from a place of I am my own audience here, and I'm using this writing as a way to really digest and make sure I'm learning this book. I don't want to have to reread a book because I've forgotten things, so it's a way to try to really bed down what I've got out of it. I then, was doing some blogging out the books I read, and also I feel like a lot of people I engage with through activism maybe don't have as much time or don't put as much time into reading some of the books that are out there. And so this is a bit of a service that I can render for people. Sort of, if you're not going to read how organizations develop activists, at least you can read my short summary of the book. I'm going to share like a few really top level ideas to think about with how we can review books and communicate that with an audience. As I said before, I began writing book reviews because I wanted a way that I could keep track of what I was taking away from the book. I didn't start from saying, how can I get something published? How can I write something that lots of people want to read? It was really just, what did this book mean to me? And I really encourage people to think about that as a starting point. I think the Commons is keen for people to become book reviewers, but you may not write reviews for the Commons. You might just, every time you write a book, get into the habit of writing up a couple of paragraphs about what it meant for you. I think that can be a great outcome and a really good way to bed down what you can get out of a book, whether it's nonfiction or otherwise. I think once you're sort of trying to get into that, the second point I want to make is that you don't really need to get too highfalutin about how to write a book review. It's really just a question of like, what are my thoughts about this book? And just sort of start from trying to understand your own experience. Did I agree with the author? Did I like it? Why didn't I like it? And that is really the basis for a good review. And actually appreciated, here's what I thought about it. Here's what I liked about it or not. So that's a great place to start. And I think thirdly, really in keeping in mind with this, the best way to write in a whole lot of context, but certainly I'd encourage you to adopt this when thinking out this sort of book reviewing, is to write it like a conversation. Don't sort of write it like try and get it published in the Journal of Social Sciences. I think just imagine you're sitting across the table from the reader, talking with them on a Saturday afternoon about this book and what you got out of it. In general, I think that's a really good rule for writing, but I think it certainly applies here in the case of writing book reviews as well. The book review is your subjective experience of the book, and I think it's really valid for this is what I would have liked to see. You're not necessarily saying that like Naomi Klein did something wrong by not including it. Sometimes you might be a little bit more like they've stuffed up if you want, but you're still entitled to be like, oh, like I would have been interested to hear more about this. So this is, or sometimes it's just like, this is the questions that left me asking, that's my next book perhaps, or, where I want the conversation to go. And that's an interesting point about the temptation to criticize as well. I do think it can be part of a good reflection on a book. I think it's a really good habit as a reader to be like, where do I disagree with this author? How could this book have been better? Like, what are the gaps in the argument? But also obviously good to share with an audience, here's what the book does. One other thing I did want to mention here, but there's a couple of books that have influenced how I think about writing and reading. One of these books is called How to Read Books, which sort of really talks about that idea of having sort of a critical conversation with the author and with the book as you go through, really thinking like, what is this book trying to say? Do I agree with it? Do I disagree with it? You can always do that per chapter depending on how vigorous you want to be, but it is a really good question. Really, the book reviewing begins while you're reading the book, and as you're reading the book, you're saying to yourself, like, what is the author saying? What was that chapter about? What did I take away from that? What is the author's purpose with this book? Who is the author writing for? And what are they trying to achieve is a really useful question to have in your mind as a reader. Some authors will explicitly say this. They will say, like, I am writing this book to offer an analysis of Scott Morrison's performance on the 2022 election campaign. And then after, like, that's sort of the yardstick you can then hold them to. And it's nice when authors can be clear about that. Sometimes they're not, and you can sort of say, I think what this author is trying to do is this. Do they do it? That's another question. The other book is How to Take Smart Notes, which is also a book about how to read books, really. It's how to sort of take information out of books and encode it in a way that really helps you draw upon it in the future. I guess for me, the key takeaway from that book is just the idea of trying to find of synthesizing what you get from a book into specific individual ideas and writing them up and being able to sort of summon upon them. The book talks about this guy, a social scientist, who literally had a whole box of of little memo cards, and each memo card was sort of one idea he'd taken out of a book, or he might have had a conversation. The key idea is that you actually are writing it down. You're not just sort of storing it in your mind. What I encourage you to do is next time you read something, now it might be a book, but it can literally be a newspaper article. Read something and then write afterwards a little executive summary. This is what this article is about. Now, if you're reading a 600-word article, your summary should be pretty short. If you're reading a 300-page book, it can be a bit longer. Ideally, you're sort of jotting notes as you go. You can also be like verbally journaling. You can count it with a friend, like, oh, here's the book I'm currently reading and what it's going on for me. So one thing I might highlight that can be a really useful approach for writing is to think about examples. And often good authors will put examples in the work, of course. And I guess in your review, you can either pull an example from the work to try to help illustrate the author's point, or you can like give an example to help illustrate your own point. So you might sort of say, if you're reviewing No Logo, you might give an example of blah 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 blah, like Coke did this in the 1980s to make it seem like they were hip and cool, whatever. And that sort of specific example can really help people to get into like the point of the book. You might read something and not be liking it, and this is an exercise in self-awareness. Like, why do I not like this book? What isn't it doing for me? How would I articulate the criticism? Even if you don't articulate it to anyone else, that can be a good reflective process. My practice in terms of what I actually do, whether or not it's best practice, is I try just to be really mindful of like the perspective that I bring. In general, like obviously reading books by people who offer different perspectives to what you're used to, who maybe like whose books don't get read as much, don't get that opportunity, and writing reviews of those books is a great way to like boost their profile. But one way of thinking about the writing is you can almost imagine, you can literally write with headings that are questions. So the first question might be like, what is this book about? Second question is, what did the author do well? Third question is, what is their key point? What do I disagree with? You can have those headings, you can write under those headings, and then you can take out the headings. And there's like this implicit structure, an implicit question that each paragraph is answering, or set of paragraphs, but you don't actually need the questions in there anymore. Sometimes it works to leave the headings in, but it is, if you've written like good prose, often the headings are sort of quite strong in the text themselves.
I wondered if you think there's an optimal length for a review, like don't go longer than this, or
it's hard to say. I don't think there's a simple answer, except for the fact that sometimes reading more is a great way to get people to, the more you write, the less people will read, in a sort of inverse way. And so I am always mindful of that. But I think for me, again, I just start from like having a conversation with myself, unpack my thoughts, and then sometimes that ends up being 2,000 words, sometimes it ends up being 600 words. If it's getting longer, so then I think how you structure it and sort of present it to the reader is really important. And good authors will do that within the book. They'll be like, here's part 1, here's part 2, here are my 3 points for part 1. I really appreciate that from authors. I guess it's sort of a question of like, who is your audience for this review? Now, as I said, your first audience is yourself. You're writing it for yourself. But I guess if you're reviewing a therapy book, sort of, are you reviewing it for a therapy practitioner who sort of, has read a whole bunch of Jung or whatever, or are you writing it for sort of a lay audience? I think that's a question that informs some sort of how you pitch the review, the level of detail and sort of explication that you would include upon different terminology. In some ways, like the most sort of humble review, you're writing it for a general audience and you're not presupposing too much knowledge, but obviously it can be a more valuable review when you're sort of saying, well, of course you've read, this is how it's like a bit like Bill Moyers doing Democracy. And this is how it's like, you can sort of assume like a certain background that can make it easier to give a richer review. But I think it's certainly a question to have in mind about if you are publishing something, who is your audience? What sort of background are you assuming that they have? One of the nice things about the Commons is you can also like link to other books or reviews. So, I say like, oh, this reminds me of doing Democracy, and link to it. So it's quite useful to have all that information in the one place. And I actually think that good book reviews will have some narrative to them. A review that's just like, I read the book, this is what was in the book, is maybe less interesting than one that's like, here's what led me to the book. Here is my story. And I'm actually weaving a narrative. Like you read the book over time and a book takes us on a journey, but you can almost weave a narrative around that. Why did I read this book? Like what led up to this point? What happens in this book? This is sort of the act 2 when you're actually reading the book. And then what has changed me in the world? How are things different? It's almost the act 3.